Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar on gray water and what's allowed in Colorado. This webinar will be recorded and the recording will be sent out to all attendees. If there are any issues with audio, please write me in the chat. My name is Erica DeLello and I'm a project manager for NORESCO. And this series is sponsored by the Colorado Energy Office with materials created by Colorado Code Consulting. We have been working with the Colorado Energy Office to provide trainings just like this one. And here, the next slide, I have listed all of the trainings within this series over the next few months. There will be a link sent out in a follow-up email if you would like to register for any of the other webinars listed. We're also offering tailored group trainings or technical assistance for jurisdictions that are updating I-codes and would like to discuss just technical assistance program for code adoption. Feel free to reach out to me. And then in addition to the trainings and technical assistance, we've put together a code adoption toolkit that reviews cost implications of changing code cycles, the benefits, other compliance resources, a whole variety of things throughout. This is the code adoption toolkit. We also have a troubleshooting guide as well that covers I-code conflicts, alignments, clarifications, passive compliance. So there's a variety of resources that are available on the Colorado Energy Office's website for you to check out. Throughout the webinar, we do want to encourage questions. So please use the Q&A function it should be at the bottom of your window, and I'll let our presenter know at the end of the presentation. The chat window can be used to chat among participants as well, but please use the Q&A function if you'd like to ask a question. There is also the ability to raise your hand, and at the end of the presentation, I can go ahead and unmute you so you can ask Hope directly. Lastly, there will be a survey window at the end that pops up. If you could please take a moment to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve on these webinars. Today, our presenter is Hope Medina. She is a green and energy code consultant for Colorado Code Consulting. She has worked on a national level to develop, promote, and assist with adopting the green energy codes. She's a governing member of the ICC Sustainability Membership Council, a consensus committee member, and a task group chair of the National Green Building Standard, and has been for several cycles. So with that, I'll let Hope take it from here. Hope, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so you can go ahead and share yours.
All right, perfect. Okay. I'm just going to ask real quick, Erica, do you happen to see my slides right now?
I think you have it, you need to reverse the display.
Okay.
So if you go back to sharing your screen, there's in the PowerPoint options, you can reverse the screens.
Okay. Did I fix it?
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your assistance.
No problem.
So thank you for having me here today. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to have a chat about gray water, and we're going to talk about what Colorado is going to allow per the current regulation 86. Water is one of those subjects in Colorado that's kind of one of those touchy things. Many people feel, kind of hands off. We don't have the rights for the water. The water is, has an obligation for, other locations, other states, other countries. And so Colorado has kind of had a hands off thought process when it comes to water as far as, the residents for Colorado. But now there's an understanding with all of the current conditions, like I stated earlier, the obligation for the amount of water that we need to move along down the various rivers, for the compacts that are involved, and just the sheer fact of being able to maintain the residents that we have now and having that water available for them, there's an understanding that we have to start looking at other options. And one of those options that Colorado really kind of embraced was the concept of gray water. And so Regulation 86 does give local jurisdictions the opportunity to incorporate gray water. So I wanted to give you, a brief history as far as how gray water has been incorporated into the I-CODES family. And so we have to look back to the very first edition that ICC published for the International Plumbing Code. And gray water were provisions in there. It was located in the appendix, but it was an option for those who wanted to have the possibility of gray water. So if you adopted the appendix, you would be able to enforce gray water within your jurisdiction. Now in the 2008 edition of ICC 700, which happens to be the National Green Building Standard, there was a reference in there that gave you credit if you happen to utilize gray water for your flushing, irrigation, just basically if you were utilizing a gray water system, you got to have credit in it. Then a really fantastic thing happened. In the 2012 IPC, in the main body of the code, in fact, chapter 13 was dedicated to gray water provisions. And not only was it located within the IPC, in the induction of the IGCC, the International Green Construction Code, there were provisions in there that dealt with and as far as utilizing gray water systems when you are a commercial project, which is fantastic that it's become a little bit more mainstream there. And then the most wonderful thing happened for gray water is the 2015 now houses it just in the IPC. It's no longer considered, necessarily maybe a green provision. It's just a provision that you're going to find within the plumbing code, and it's just accepted as a plumbing code option there. And so, looking at some of these things, you can see the progression of the acceptance of gray water and the fact that it's getting utilized in more ways than maybe it has been in the past. And we're not talking necessarily just in Colorado. We're talking about, nationally, it's something that was readily accepted in many locations. So here's a quick history as far as how gray water came about for Colorado. Because as I referred to, earlier, water is extremely precious here in Colorado. It's extremely valuable in so many ways. And recognizing that, legislation actually brought forward a House bill, which was House Bill 13-1044. On January 9th of 2013, it was introduced to the House. It went through various processes and actually went through, I would say rather unencumbering as far as, some of the bills that get introduced to our legislation. And so it passed. It made it through the House, it made it through the Senate, and on May 15th of 2013, the governor signed the bill, which is fantastic because this stated, okay, great. We can now permit gray water within Colorado. And in that bill, there was a lot of guidance and information provided as how we were going to do this. It talked about, for jurisdictions, you're going to have to get buy-in from your water purveyor, your sewer purveyor, because when everything is said and done, those are, some of the entities that are going to be affected by if you're going to utilize gray water within Colorado. And so that bill provided a lot of guidance and spurred the fact that, okay, so now we have to come up with the regulations as far as how this is going to be implemented within Colorado. So in 2013, that law came over to the Public Health and Environment, and then it was later determined that water quality control was actually going to be the ones that were going to develop this type of regulation. So in 2013, 2014, 2015, they developed, and we now have our gray water control regulations. And so Regulation 86 was adopted by the Water Quality Control Commission in 2015. And as you can see on the screen there, it was adopted in May of 2015. It went into effect June 30th. It was amended in November 9th of 2015. And then that amendment went into effect December 30th of 2015. So it's been a little bit of an evolving regulation. The reason why it was amended was they were trying to make some clarification because there was some concern about a few of the areas. Now that wasn't the end of it. Part of what had to happen so this could be implemented was the sheer fact that the State Plumbing Board had to adopt those provisions within the 2015 IPC. And what ended up happening is the State Plumbing Board did adopt the 2015 IPC, and then there was a caveat kind of deal that Chapter 13 and 14 that dealt with, some of these more unusual provisions that Colorado hasn't accepted and, permitted in the past. They had to look into it. And ultimately, when everything was said and done, Chapter 13 and 14 was adopted by the state. So the state has adopted the 2015 IPC. Now, this is where it becomes, your choice, right? So any local city, counties, or city and county can submit a gray water control plan. And this is where you can start your history. So we keep throwing out gray water, and it's just an assumption that we know exactly what gray water is. So I thought I'd bring in some of these definitions here, because as you can see, while the concept of it is the same, they're really spelling it out differently. So the Cambridge Dictionary says, water that has been used before, for example, for washing, and that can be stored and reused again. Very simple. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary says, household wastewater as from a sink or bath that does not contain serious contaminants as from toilets or diapers. And then Wikipedia, I thought, kind of really gave a more encompassing definition as far as what gray water is. And it states that the wastewater generated in households or office buildings from streams without fecal contamination, all streams except for wastewater from toilets. Resources of gray water include sinks, showers, baths, washing machines, or dishwashers. Now, just because that is what, how they're defining it, that does not necessarily mean that's how Colorado is defining it. So Colorado defines it within their regulation of 86. They call it that gray water means that portion of the wastewater that before being treated or combined with other wastewater is collected from fixtures within residential, commercial, or industrial buildings or institutional facilities for the purpose of being put to beneficial uses. Sources of gray water are limited to discharges from bathrooms and laundry room sinks, bathtub showers, and laundry machines. Gray water does not include wastewater from toilets, urinals, kitchen sinks, dishwashers, or non-laundry utility sinks. So as you can see, Colorado defines it that you can utilize a bathroom or laundry room sink. You can use the water from bathtubs and showers, and laundry machines are permitted within the state. Now, the locations that they're not permitted is toilets, urinals, kitchen sinks, dishwashers, and any non-utility sink. And when they start talking about non-laundry utility sinks, they're talking about, because sometimes you'll find a sink maybe that's in a garage and it's utilized for, garage purposes. So you want to make sure that the contaminants that you would typically, utilize that sink for, washing your hands because you have grease on it, because you've been working on the car, whatever the case may be, that's not going into these gray water systems. So Regulation 86 is a voluntary option for any city, county, and county if they choose that they want to adopt the use of gray water. Now, what 86 does is it tells you that, one, it's voluntary. So, each jurisdiction gets to decide whether this is something that's going to work for what they want. And what 86 does is really just kind of gives you your minimum design criteria and all of the control measures that are going to have to be utilized to be able to have these gray water control programs. Now, I talk about gray water control programs, but we'll get into that just a little bit later, but I really do think we need to define exactly what that's going to be. So what is the first step? If you're a jurisdiction and you're thinking, you know what, I really think that this could be a huge benefit, for our community, because one, we know, our reservoir, is not so full. We want to make sure that we have the water. What are the options? What are the steps that we can take to make sure that, one, we're a community that can sustain ourselves, but we also want to provide the opportunity that we can have future growth. And so how do we do that? So the first step that you're going to want to do is you're going to have to adopt an ordinance for your gray water control program. Now, like I said earlier, I'm throwing out this word, these words, gray water control program, and that's what is, referred to when we start talking about Regulation 86. And so let's kind of get into the meat and bones of what you're going to find within what needs to be provided within your gray water control program. So the first thing you have to say is, hey, we're going to have one. Okay, so we've made that decision. That's what we're going to do. Now we have to understand what we're going to do if we happen to have any gray water systems that were existing before we make this decision, before we make that ordinance saying, hey, we're going to do this. There were some that were in existence prior to this. Now those existing systems are going to have to meet whatever your new gray water control program parameters are. And then they're also going to have to comply with whatever your local public health agency is going to require. So if it's existing, it can still exist. It may just have to, kind of be brought up to the newer code kind of deal. You have to understand that there is a possibility that gray water systems can be revoked. They can be revoked for multiple reasons. I think, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as far as, the reasons why there may be that you would revoke this. But then there's another thing that you also have to keep in mind is you have to figure out what are you going to do if you annex property into your jurisdiction and you don't have a gray water control program, but they happen to have one. You're going to have to figure out what's gonna apply with that, and then you have to notify the owner, and then the owner has 1 year to comply with whatever is set forth within your control program. So gray water is only permitted if you have a gray water control program, and so it has to meet all of your requirements. It has to be minimally designed to what you're going to find in the regulation, but it also has to comply with everything that you as an entity are going to require. You're not allowed to have gray water discharge in locations that are prohibited. and you cannot have it discharge if you happen to have a Colorado discharge permit system. And I believe that that has to deal with if you happen to have a, oh shoot, that word just went out my brain. Your own individual sewer system. So if you have that at that point, gray water may not be possible. Now let's talk about enforcement, because I'm sure you're all on here just dying to know, one, how are you going to be able to enforce this? What is the enforcement mechanisms? What are we going to do? Well, the great thing is it's the city and county, or the county itself, and they are the ones that are exclusively responsible for the enforcement of your ordinance. So you as an entity are going to be enforcing and regulating your ordinance. The state does not really come into effect here. Where the state is involved is they oversee the statewide implementation of this program, meaning, okay, so you have adopted a gray water control program ordinance. They're going to make sure that you provide that ordinance to them within 60 days of it being adopted. So that's something that they would take a look at. And then they're going to review the ordinance, and the ordinance, they're going to review it and make sure that things are actually, per how the regulation states. So those are some of the oversight that you're going to see from the state, but basically the enforcement comes from the entity itself. So this is where some of the things that you're actually going to have to identify. So you're going to have to talk about in your ordinance, you're going to have to comply with the ordinance. You're going to have to comply with federal, state, and local requirements. Now, one of the big things is you're going to have to define the boundary of your jurisdiction, right? As I stated earlier, if you annex, land that's going to be brought into your jurisdiction, or your de-annex, area that is no longer going to be in your jurisdiction, whatever the case may be, defining what your jurisdiction is going to be very important down the road for you. Another thing is you have to identify who's going to be responsible for implementation and who's going to oversee, these particular regulations. So you're going to have somebody who's going to, review the design. You're going to have somebody who is in charge of doing the inspections for these systems. Who's going to enforce the ordinance? Who's going to track the ordinance, because there are requirements for tracking, and who's going to track all of the complaints that come in from it, and who's going to, you also have to identify what your fees that you're going to charge for this. So this is all stuff that's going to have to be within your ordinance itself. Now, I mentioned about tracking. They want to have a very detailed mechanism in place as far as being able to search for these gray water systems. And in it, there's going to be, you have to have information as far as the address, which makes sense, right? Where is it going to be installed? We ask for addresses for everything. So address, who the responsible party is. So who, maybe it's the building owner, whoever the case may be, whoever that responsible party is, that information has to be trackable. Where it's, where you require it, there may be locations where it's required, but a certified associate may be involved with it, and that's going to have to be provided so that it can be trackable. And then whoever is, if there happens to be any changes as far as your responsible party or the certified operator, that has to be trackable, and that status has to be provided and updated within 60 days of it happening. And so these are some of the things that are going to have to be established, and then something that you're going to be enforcing as the entity yourself. So now we're going to start to get into a little bit more of like the actual gray water design criteria that's required. You're going to be needing to demonstrate that these particular requirements are at least as stringent as what you're going to find within the regulation. You're going to have to provide some protocol for when you're dealing with subsurface irrigation systems. One of the things that you're going to have to put in this ordinance is you're going to have to identify which gray water use category you're going to permit. And we'll talk about what the categories are here very shortly. But that's something that you're going to have to really look at and determine what you're going to do. And you have to spell it out basically in your ordinance. You're also going to be required to, inspect and verify by whichever agency is going to be responsible for it. And then there's going to be some reporting that's going to be required. Now, when you receive design documentation for gray water systems, they have 10 items that are absolutely required. You can have additional items, but these are the 10 mandatory items that the regulation calls out for. And it's the gray water use. What use are you using? What the location for these gray water treatment systems, right? Because you could have it in one area and not in the other area. You're going to have to provide your design flow calculations for the gray water treatment. These are all things that should be supplied to you as a jurisdiction or an entity, not something that the entity itself is going to have to do. This is all stuff that should be provided for you. The fixtures that are going to be the source of the gray water, where's the gray water being collected, the design of the plumbing and irrigation system, depending on which one is going to be applicable, the description of the products or components, if it's applicable, depending on what type of system you're going to utilize, the supporting soils analysis information. I'll kind of talk about that a little bit later. The contact information for any system designer, professional engineer, or operator. Very important for you. If you have any questions, this is definitely, information that as an entity you're going to want, whether you're the design reviewer, the keeper of the records, or, the inspector. All that information you're going to want to, make sure that the name and address of the legally responsible party. Like I said, that's part of the tracking mechanism. And then it has to be signed. The documents have to be signed by the legally responsible party. So whoever that may be, the owner, the designer, whatever the case may be, who's ever taken responsibility, that's who it is. So when we start talking about items to approve or deny the installation of it, again, those same 10 items become, really a part of whether you're going to approve or deny it. If it doesn't meet any of these 10 items that are required, then at that point, you have the option of being able to deny the use of the gray water system. Now, we need to talk a little bit about, discontinuing local gray water programs. So let's say your entity thinks it's a great idea. You're really hoping that this is going to be one of those solutions that you need, but there are some things that you have to understand, and there may be some unintended consequences. Let's say you're using it for, one category over the other. Well, there may be a possibility that less water will be going into the sewers. And so your sewer purveyors may have some issues with the lack of water that's being done. And so their systems are not able to run, in the fashion that they were designed to. Well, they kind of supersede a little bit. And if there is an issue, and the entities are, understanding that, we just can't continue this, you may discontinue your gray water control program. Now, if you do that, you do have some options. In the regulation, you are provided with 3 options. You can either require that it is physically removed or permanently disconnected, or what you may do is you're going to regulate what your existing gray water systems are under what would be considered a limited gray water control program, meaning, okay, you know what, we understand that we have 10 permits out there. These 10 permits are, you know, going to stay into effect. We're going to allow those 10 properties, 10 entities to continue utilizing their gray water system. But what we're going to have to do is, just due to unforeseen circumstances, we're just not going to be able to allow any new systems to go in. And so that would be a situation maybe that you would consider it as a limited gray water and not allowing new ones. Now, another thing is, if you happen to be, you could potentially allow, or you may be under agreement where another jurisdiction would take control of the gray water program, take control of yours. So you have a neighboring jurisdiction, you decide this isn't something that we can oversee, but they have a really robust program. They said that they'll do it. You have some sort of a discussion. And so another jurisdiction then takes over your gray water control program. And in doing so, what ends up happening, there could be potential, I don't want to say complications, but potential additional requirements that may have to go into effect for your existing systems. They have to comply with whoever is now overseeing the control program. You have to follow, be in line with all of theirs. So maybe you had 10 of those items that were required, and maybe the new oversee of the control program, they have 11. So that additional requirement, your existing gray water control systems would have to do that additional one to meet the new control program. So let's talk about these allowable gray water use categories. So the first one is category A, and that is a single family, and it's the uses that you can utilize the gray water would be for subsurface irrigation. So for that to happen, you have to be a single family user. You have to have a design flow of 400 gallons per day or less. It can only be utilized for outdoor subsurface irrigation within the confines of that legal property boundary, and that is extremely important. You remember earlier when I mentioned about complaints, this would be an area that complaints could potentially manifest itself as if it was not confined within its own property boundary. Now, the second category that you have is category B, and it's non-single family subsurface irrigation. Now, for this particular category, it's for non-single family users. You have a design flow of 2,000 gallons per day or less. And it can, again, only be utilized for outdoor subsurface irrigation within the confines of that legal property boundary. Now, category C is where you're going to see multiple uses. You're going to see the option, it's for single family, it's for indoor toilet and urinal flushing, and it's for subsurface irrigation. So those are the options that you would be able to utilize. And so to meet that, you have to be a single family user. You have to have a design flow of 400 gallons or less. And it can be utilized for indoor toilets and urinal flushing, and for outdoor subsurface irrigation, again, within the property boundaries. Now, the last option is category D. And again, this is dealing with non-single family. It's indoor toilet and urinal flushing, and it's also for subsurface irrigation. So to meet this particular category, you would have to be a non-single family user. You cannot have a flow rate that is over 2,000 gallons a day. And your indoor toilet and urinal flushing, and for subsurface irrigation. And again, it has to be within the boundaries of the legal property. So we talked about single family. And so single family, as it's defined within the regulation, says that it means a detached or attached structure arranged and designed as a single family residential unit intended to be occupied not more than by one family, and it must have its own separate water and sewer service connections to that particular dwelling unit. So whether it looks like this or it looks like that, as long as it has its own sewer, it has its own water, then you're good to go and you can utilize a gray water system. Now, non-single family, as it's defined within the regulation, is nothing. There's no actual definition within the regulation as far as what is a non-single family. I think it's very similar to what you would find, you know, on the in the IECC. You have a definition of what a residential building is, and then commercial, it says anything that doesn't fall under residential. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. While it doesn't say, you know, anything that's not a single family is now a non-single family, I think we can all infer that that's what the intent is. So a non-single family is, you know, commercial or attached dwelling that does not have its own separate water and sewer. So subsurface irrigation, as it's defined within the regulation, states that it is a means of gray water discharge that has a minimum of 4 inches below the surface, but not more than 12 inches below the surface. So whatever your finished grade is, and as you can see, it's just basically, you know, what you'll see often is just a pipe. There's some holes, you know, water, you know, moves through it, it feeds it, it's all underground, it's contained underground. So there's no possibility really of, you know, it becoming, you know, an aerosol type up in the air, because there's always a concern, and we have to understand that while it goes through all this stuff, there is a concern as far as, you know, potential pathogens with it. And so this is why it's contained within the soil itself, and it's not available for sprinkler systems, right? But this is an option, and it is an option for all of the categories. All of the categories state subsurface irrigation. Now, indoor toilet and urinal flushing, as it's defined within the regulation, it's not defined. But I think we can all pretty much understand, you know, what they're calling for. It's water that's going to be utilized to flush a toilet or flush a urinal. And this option is only permitted if you choose to utilize category C or category D. So here's where it might get a little interesting for, you know, the code officials that are on board here, is if you go into 8612, this is where it starts to get into a lot of the fun stuff for us. So in design category A, section A, it states that it has to meet the regulations and of the Colorado Plumbing Code. And the Colorado Plumbing Code currently is the 2015 IPC, which happens to contain chapter 13. So we are good there. Your treatment design flows, you have to have them calculated for your peak gray water production if upstream of your storage or no tank is used. So keep that in mind. Plumbing that allows the treatment process of storage tanks cannot be bypassed prior to the gray water use. You're going to have to include a diversion valve that directs the gray water to the gray water treatment works, and it has to be, you know, easily operable, clear labeled, a lot of the things that we're very accustomed to when you start looking into the IPC, saying, you know, label, tell me what it is. And the same thing is in effect here for your diversion valve. Now, your storage tank has a whole lot of provisions that, you know, it needs to demonstrate. And when you start looking online and you start looking at some of the gray water storage tanks, a lot of them already have all this information shown on them, at least, when I was doing looking, that was something that was very readily able to find. So I don't think this is going to be something that's going to be an issue. Now, if you happen to utilize category C and D that you're going to utilize for, the gray water for toilet and urinal flushing, there are some requirements that you need to be aware of. You're going to have backup potable water. Make sure that you have something obviously as a backup. And then you also have to make sure that you do not have any uncontrolled cross connections between the potable water and the gray water treatment. And that's for both the what they're calling non-public and public, which is kind of, in my head, I think of more of residential and commercial, right? Gray water treatment works. You also have to deal with, you cannot reduce the design capacity when you're dealing with, the outdoor water or on-site water treatment systems or any domestic wastewater treatment works. You have to make sure that you have the correct piping designation that's on there, and it has to be identified. You have to show, what direction the flows are going. And for us in Colorado, one of the things that, is rather important is making sure that these systems, aren't located in the 100-year floodplain, and that if they are, they exceed the requirements that FEMA has established. They can't be in the floodways. They can be in the floodplain, but not in the floodways. And we have to make sure that everything is confined within the legal property boundary, and it cannot be within an easement. Now there's very specific design criteria when we start talking about the subsurface irrigation system. That's 8612B. It talks about the setback requirements, knowing where that tank is, where the piping is, where the discharge is. It has to be so many feet from the property line, so many feet from if you have a well. There's a table in there that gives you all of that information. It also gives you the protocols so that you can be able to size everything appropriately. And then it also gives you a table that gives you some information for the type of soil that you're working with. So we want to make sure that it's, a type of soil that's going to take all of this. And then if you were to choose to utilize a mulch basin approach of the irrigation system, there are requirements for that also. Now, 8612C talks about the criteria for if you're going to utilize it for toilets or urinal flushes. You have to have a disinfectant system, and there's actually a dye concentration, so there is recognition. There's also a lot of requirements as far as signage, making sure that it states, hey, we're using irrigation, gray water for irrigation. It must follow all of these assignments. Whatever the case may be, there are signage that's required. And last but not least is the fact that there is requirements for operation and maintenance manuals, right? Because here you go, you design this system, building owner walks in, oh great, we have gray water system, and has absolutely no idea. So there are requirements, you have to, show them how it works, have a maintenance manual there so that at least the information is provided for the building owner so that it can be maintained properly, which is what we all hope for. Now, there are more items that you're going to find within this, requirements, this regulation. We could do an hour on each of these particular subsections very easily. So this is just a brief overview of what it says. So what is the next step? What you've decided, I gave you all that information. You say, hey, it doesn't seem so bad. What do I need to do? We're going to make that adoption, that ordinance. Now we have to decide how and who will enforce the program. And I think this is probably one of those areas that, really pops up for people is, who's responsible? And the building official, the first thing that they start thinking about is, my department right now is so, understaffed as it is, how am I going to add one more thing for them to worry about? And the really nice thing is, you know what, we have to remember that enforcement is adopted by the entity, right? So that entity is your jurisdiction. Often it's not the building department that is actually in charge of the enforcement or the implementation. When I was reaching out to a few of the jurisdictions that have actually submitted a gray water control program, the building department is involved with it, but they're not overseeing it. They're not implementing it. They are a part of it, because this is a joint venture between everyone, but they're not the one that is being responsible for it. Now, one thing I will say is that this option is very underutilized currently. When I was reaching out to everyone, one of the things that came up was the fact that so far there was only one permit that was in the process. It hadn't even been installed yet. So for the jurisdictions that did respond back to me, there was one. So it's not being heavily utilized yet. So I think some of the lessons learned, what can we do kind of deal is still out there. Now, I remember when this first came into effect, and I was speaking at the Next Generation Water Summit, and a gentleman from the state of Colorado, when this first went into effect, came out and had a session out there, and it was very informative. I loved it. And one of the things that he had mentioned was the fact that they hadn't had any permits so far. And I asked him, was the possibility of it being potentially revoked, a deterrent for people wanting to be able to do this? And he, we had a great discussion, but that is something that may potentially be a hurdle, for the state overall. We'll have to figure out how we can really utilize this really well and, promote its use. So the next thing is, what do we allow? You have so many options, right? I gave you 4, but that's so many options for Colorado, you have to admit. So how do you make the decision as far as, which option you're going to utilize? Are you going to be, be a category A and category B, where you're just going to allow it for irrigation? Are you also going to allow it for, the flushing of your toilets and urinals? Where do you stand on this? How do you make this decision? And I think probably one of the best ways that you're going to do this is, obviously you're going to have, the stakeholders. All the stakeholders are going to be involved, not just the different departments within the jurisdiction itself, but you're going to have to listen to your business owners. You're going to have to listen to your residents, because what are they going to be comfortable with? Because you can always amend your ordinance. So if the concern is, maybe we don't want to have the toilet and urinal flushing because we have a dog that likes to drink out of the toilet and we prefer him not to do that, or to, have any, difficulties or problems that may arise from that, then it would make sense that you're going to, permit category A and category B. Now, if you happen to be in an area that is really struggling right now as far as, the drought and the water, maybe utilizing it as category C and D as an option, because, hey, we need all the help that we can get to maintain, water for our constituents, then category C and D may make a lot of sense. Or, you're for your jurisdiction, you're just fully on board. You see the value of this and you just say, hey, we're doing it all. So, you have to really kind of make the decision based on, what your constituents, what the stakeholders, where everybody feels comfortable with. So why would you want to go through the hassle? Let's think about this, because water truly is more valuable than gold. We have to think about it, from the perspective of Colorado, right? We have incredible drought conditions, and our drought conditions are not just, here and there. we're talking about decades of droughts. This is basically, I don't think we can really call it a drought anymore. Actually, several of us in the water world, we've been talking about it. It's not really a drought. This is just the norm. This is legitimately what the water is. This is how much water we have, and we have to understand, we have to start working within the confines of what is available for us, not what we would like to have. You know, the other thing is we have to think about all the various water compacts that are out there, right? We're involved with a lot of them. We have, you know, the 7th state, we, you know, dealing with the Colorado River, dealing with the Rio Grande. You know, we have to make sure that, you know, we're getting and the water's going where it's supposed to be going. And then we have to address the fact that, you know, we are involved in lawsuits that deal with water provisions, right? You know, the good and bad is, I'll tell you this story really quick, but, you know, the good and bad about when, you know, Republicans and Democrats get together and they say, hey, you know, we want to work together. And that happened down in Texas a few years ago. And they said, we're not getting our water. What are we going to do about it? Well, one of them, you know, one side said, you know, let's start conserving our water. You know, how do we do that? We make sure that, you know, things are, you know, efficient. And then the other one said, hey, we need to, you know, up our supply. We need to get the supply that's due to us, that's been allocated to us. So, you know, that is something that, you know, Colorado is fully aware of. And, you know, I think more and more of the, you know, quote unquote, you know, regular folks in communities are understanding the fact that, you know, water is very precious. And so we also have to remember that, you know, we really do need to be good stewards of our resources and utilize sustainable practices, because not only, like I stated earlier, do we want to make sure that our current residents have, you know, good drinking water, you know, for the rest of the time that they're residing there, and anybody who's going to reside in those buildings in the future. We also want to make sure that we have the water for any future growth, right? So these are things that we really want to, you know, be aware of, and we want to make sure that we're part of the solution. I know many of you may or may not know where your water comes from, but on the Front Range here, a lot of the jurisdictions, the water comes from the Big Thompson Project. The picture that you see there is from a few weeks ago. I was driving to Steamboat Springs. I always look at there to, you know, kind of gauge where things are. As I was driving to Steamboat Springs, I saw how low the water was. Now understanding that, you know, it changes with the seasons, you know, sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less. You know, I've been going out there for the last couple of years about this time of year, and it was enough. It caught my attention so much that I was trying to find a place to pull over. I was willing to cross the highway so I could get a picture of how low, you know, the Thompson reservoir was, because it was so significant for me. And I know you can't, it's not really easy to see, but there were places that it looked like you could actually walk because you could see the bottom of where, you know, it resided. So I want to thank you. Hope Medina with Colorado Code Consulting. My contact information is available there if you have any questions. You know, please feel free to reach out to me. Water is my passion. I love talking water. I go all over the country and talk about water, so I'm happy to talk about water to anyone. And then again, if you are interested, you want some, you know, assistance, some additional training for energy topics, please feel free to reach out to Erica or to the Colorado Energy Office. And then on the left-hand side there, you can see the upcoming webinar topics. And with that, I turn it back over to you, Erica.
Great, thanks, Hope. That was very informative. One of our first actual water topics, so that was great information. It looks like we do have one question, so if anyone else does have any questions, feel free to write in the Q&A, or feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you to ask the question directly. But to start us off, is rainwater collection as a source of gray water part of the regulation?
No. They're very specific as far as they're two very separate items. Now they did kind of come about a little bit together, I guess you could say. The thought process was, but they're two separate entities, and I do not recall anywhere in there that rainwater is permitted to be utilized for any gray water systems, at least per regulation 86. Now I know within the rainwater regulations, it has their regulations as far as what you can utilize it for. I think part of it is dealing with irrigation, but as far as utilizing gray water within your or rainwater within your gray water system, I don't believe that that is permitted per regulation 86.
Okay, thank you. I do have Jeff Wong here who's raised his hand, so I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk. You are live, Jeff.
Hey, I was wondering if you could give a couple examples of jurisdictions that are kind of at the forefront of this and where they're at in terms of implementation.
Sure. When this law was actually presented to the House, one of the entities that were in support of it was actually Denver Water. And so the city and county of Denver was also very much in support of this going through. So Denver right now is currently one, if I remember correctly, is the one permit that is in effect right now that's going through the process of it. I know Pitkin County does have it, I think, and they were one of the very first ones to go through the process to establish their control program. From last I heard, they hadn't had any permits as of yet.
Great, thank you. One other question for you. How does the regulation address water quality? I'm thinking about concentration and dilution of detergents.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of where that is, because there is some information as far as how you're going to treat it. Let me see if I can find it really quick here. And I'm more than happy to provide you with a link or send you the actual regulation if you are interested in it. But it does have some information. You have to have a certain type of concentration, and then there are some dyes that are involved. I know the detergent is an issue, which is one of the reasons I thought it was interesting that they do permit it from clothes washers, but not dishwashers. I was surprised that they included clothes washers as an acceptable I'm not able to find it really quick here. It's a 34-page document as far as the regulations. So there's a few things you have to kind of work through here, but
Okay, well, Adam, if you would like to follow up with Hope, I'm sure she can talk you through that a little bit more. We do have a couple more questions to get through before the session's over. So next up is it correct that many of the state water compacts are expiring in 2021? If this is true, what issues do you see moving forward and how it might affect Colorado?
That is very interesting. I would have to go back and look, because the 7-state and Mexico compact, which deals with the Colorado River, that compact, they had I don't want to call an amendment to it, but an adjustment to it. And I'm not sure if anybody was following it. I think it was last year, and then Arizona was not signing onto it. I would have to look. I don't see that it's something that's ending anytime soon. So I'm not sure, you know, on that. I'll have to actually dig that out and take a look at the amendment on that.
Sounds good.
But they've been in effect since like 1927 or 57, depending on which one. And the year that they did all the measurements was an extremely wet year for Colorado. And that's why, you know, we're struggling so much and we have all those lawsuits in effect because we're not moving the water down as we've been obligated to for quite some time.
Makes sense. All right, last question for you, Hope. Are there commercially available systems that will easily allow residential users to integrate gray water into drip irrigation? And do you have an idea of ballpark costs?
I don't have a ballpark cost for you, but there, if you go online, you'll see a lot of commercial systems. And I believe they can be utilized for either commercial or for, you know, residential applications. I'm trying to think, if you want to reach out to me because you have some questions, I do have a contact. I'll have to see if I can find it for you, but he does some work as far as drip irrigations and dealing with the gray water systems.
Perfect. Do you want to switch back to your contact slide, Hope, so people can have your contact information?
There we go.
Great. Well, those are all the questions that we have for today. I want to thank everyone for joining and thank Hope for taking the time to present today. Feel free to reach out to me or her if you do have any follow-up questions, and don't forget to fill out that survey that pops up. So thank you all, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.